You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Dr. Mac Callaham, a research ecologist and team leader in the United States Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture. Dr. Callaham has decades of experience exploring how soil ecology can be used for efforts like restoring ecosystems after disturbances. And specifically, he focuses on the organisms that live within soil and how to manage invasive species that can get in these places. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very excited to dive into this increasingly important area of work. Especially when I've talked to other ecologists, they've told me about how soil ecology has been this area that they're now starting to become more aware of. So I know that we'll be diving into a bunch of very interesting concepts today. But before all that, I'd love to just hear a little bit about yourself, what you're working on today, and how you got involved in this area of research.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure for me, and thanks for the invitation to join you on the podcast. My name is Mac Callaham, and I'm a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service. That's in the United States Department of Agriculture. In the unit that I work in, we concern ourselves with disturbance ecology, and so that involves a number of different disciplines. And so we're, by the very nature of the makeup of our unit, we do a lot of interdisciplinary research. So it's been a lot of fun. So if you can think about what you hear about in the news in terms of forest disturbance, you might think about forest fire. You might think about windstorms, for example. In the part of the continent where we work in the southeast, we have a lot of hurricane and tornado events, which are important. And then there are other things that you might not think about quite as regularly, but things like invasive species and those kinds of things. And that's really where my work has gone over the past now 20 years. We look at invasive plants, we look at invasive animals, and because my training has been in soils, and in particular in soil biology, I have spent a lot of time thinking about invasive soil animals and their potential impacts on forest soil processes and these kinds of things. So if people ask me what I do, I say I'm a soil ecologist specializing in invasive species.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that when it comes to this area of work, I never would have actually known about the importance it has until we talked to this one ecologist working in Texas actually, and she works with the Nature Conservancy where she also does restoration work, and she was just telling me about all the ways that they'd planned this kind of intervention, and increasingly they were just becoming more and more aware of how the soil properties, they really were important for that kind of work. In high school, like I never would have heard about that. They could have such a huge impact. But that's the area that I'd like to start off with and dive a little bit deeper into the details there. So when it comes to, say, the soil in areas like forests, or the organisms like the worms, etc., in the soil, I'd love to hear about any examples of specific ecosystem services, specific species, specific regions, and how soil ecology is really fundamental to the health of those ecosystems.
Yeah, so it's probably fair to say that I'm biased, so you're going to get a little bit of a biased view about the importance of soil, but I think I can back my bias up with pretty good evidence that soils are, in fact, the underpinning of almost all terrestrial ecosystems, of course. And so they come about by a very complex set of processes that involves interplay between the prevailing climate of a region, the geology of that area, so the bedrock that is the parent material for what soils form in that location. And then, of course, those two things combine to influence the kind of vegetation that's going to occur on a particular spot. And that vegetation then feeds back into the whole ecosystem that develops, including the soil organisms and various biota that will occupy that area. And so, from our perspective, the soil is a nexus where all those interacting variables come together. And so frequently what you see is that particular ecosystems will have an associated soil type. For example, I would give the grasslands that once occupied the entire central portion of the continent, spanning from, Saskatchewan all the way down to parts of Mexico. The fact that the climate is so dry that woody vegetation like trees and forests can't be sustained, but grasses will grow there, right? So you get 10,000 or 20,000 years of grasses growing in a place. And because grass root systems decompose very slowly, you get a buildup of organic matter. And so you end up with the soils that we generally associate with grasslands. They're usually very high in organic matter, they're very rich in nutrients, and they're great for agriculture, right? So this is why in the US, I can speak for the US in particular, and in central Canada, those prairie soils have predominantly been converted to agricultural use, right? They're great for growing other grasses that humans find very useful, like corn and wheat. So I think it's been a relationship that may have been kind of taken for granted and not really carefully evaluated necessarily, that what processes historically over evolutionary time, or however you want to describe it, geologic time, those processes that gave the soils the characteristics that they have make a big difference in how humans decide to use those soils. And I think that this kind of relationship, if you really think about it, it is borne out in almost every ecosystem type that humans can really inhabit.
No, I think that's very cool. You have those intuitions behind how, say, soil can be very effectively used, say, in agriculture. There might be documentaries about how in the Arctic, like the soil dictates how you can build on places. And
Sure.
I think that those connections are a little bit familiar. What I would be a little bit more curious about is if there are any ecosystem services that happen in natural ecosystems that really rely on having healthy soil.
Hmm. Yeah. So that, I don't know exactly what your context is for ecosystem services. So as a person who's been working in ecology for a while, that terminology has a specific meaning, and it goes back to a thing that the United Nations did back in the early 2000s. So the UN tasked the scientific community with coming up with the so-called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And so the framework within which that team decided to assess ecosystems was through this concept of ecosystem goods and services. There were cultural services, provisioning services, there were supporting services, and I think that's the category in which we should most appropriately think about soils and soil processes and the soil fauna in particular. So the supporting services are things like nutrient cycling and waste recycling, and even soil formation is considered to be one of the supporting services that an ecosystem can provide. And I think that it's in that context that my bread and butter is probably most applicable, right? Which is, how do soil animals and soil biota, not just animals, but all the soil biota, how do they influence the process of soil formation, and how do they improve sustainability of the other services like provisioning of food and or fiber or wood?
Mm-hmm. Are there any examples of regions or organisms where these ecosystem services are important?
There are some examples within the soil biota in particular that I think are things that people might not think about that much, but which are crucial processes that are being done. And so one great example that I think about when I think about earthworms in particular is that there are ecosystems in Argentina and parts of Brazil. The Pantanal, I guess, is the region, the Pantanal region, where the behavior of these earthworms, they live in these soils that are saturated, completely saturated. And so the earthworms engage in this behavior where they take soil, the saturated soil, and they cast it up into these mounds, right, that are now above the surface of the water table. And then those mounds eventually turn into habitat for plants and a whole suite of other animals like pollinators and these things that would otherwise not be there, right? So the earthworms are, in this case, solely responsible for the entire ecosystem type. And so that's kind of an extreme example, but those same processes are occurring pretty much in every soil where, for example, an earthworm or an ant can exist. These organisms, the earthworms, the ants, the termites, there are some others that are also important, but these animals are constantly, if you think about it as a churning almost of the surface of the soil through their burrowing and tunneling and nest making and all these other things, they're taking soil from underneath and positioning it on top of the surface of the soil. And there's a few things that go along with that. So one thing is that anything that's on the surface ends up getting buried. If you're in a forested ecosystem, for example, you get leaf litter that's being constantly buried by the activity of these earthworms and ants and other things too, right? And so as a result, the nutrients and whatever that are tied up in that litter material, leaf litter material, gets buried in the soil, it starts to decompose, and then it becomes available for plant uptake again, right? So it's a really crucial function that these animals are performing in terms of making nutrients available for, subsequent vegetation growth. So it goes from all the way from ecosystem formation, plain and simple, in the case of the earthworms actually causing ecosystems to happen, all the way up to, just this, they're a part of a intricate connected series of processes that make these ecosystems what they are. Great examples from the tropics as well. So the leafcutter ants in the tropics. So you think about a tropical rainforest. It doesn't have to be rainforest, but anywhere in the tropics, there's a whole tribe of ants that go out into the surrounding vegetation. They cut leaves and then carry them back to the nest. And these nests can be immense, several meters in extent in any direction, out to the sides and down. And they take all this organic material that they harvest from the forest and bring it down into the soil. They grow fungi on that. And over time, you think about it, okay, there's one ant nest and it has a lifespan. It might be 10 years, it might be 15 years, one colony might last that long, right? But if you think about this over, millennial timescales, you get an ant nest in this location, then the next time it's another 10 meters away, and then the next time it's another 10 meters away. And over millennia, you end up having the entire area has been ant impacted in one way or another, right? And so all the organic matter that they bring into the soil gets incorporated and cycled, and you have to take the long view and think about how small, relatively small and discrete things that these animals are doing in one place and one time has to be considered over the course and the aerial extent and the temporal extent. And it doesn't take much imagination to see that really the entire surface of the earth over time is being processed either by ants or by termites or by earthworms or whatever you may have.
Yeah, I think those are really amazing examples, and it actually reminds me of conversations we were having with a biologist slash, I guess, cognitive scientist. She actually studied how these ants would make different trails and how that would impact the ecosystems.
And that's a whole other a whole other ball of wax. Is the social behavior of some of these creatures is really fascinating, and the evolutionary development of those superorganism type structures and functions it's not even within my purview, but those are also quite interesting subjects. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it's just very fascinating to kind of look at this area as just like a very amazing example of biology and its complexity. But as you said, it exists in a nexus, and one of the parts of that nexus is us humans, sometimes not for the best. So I know you mentioned a few of the disturbances that can happen to these soil ecosystems, including like wildfires, including invasive species. So I was hoping to hear about, especially if you do any restoration work or guided at the USDA, what are some of the common challenges that you see that can adversely affect soil health, and how do they do that?
Yeah. So where to begin with this? I would be remiss not to say that disturbance as an ecological concept can be tricky. There's an ecological definition of disturbance, and then there's sort of a more of a layperson's definition of what constitutes disturbance, and they're not always the same thing. So the example that we like to use is fire. So in many of the ecosystems of North America, fire is a natural and important process, right? And so we, if you're an ecologist, you might think, okay, fire is not necessarily a bad thing. But if you talk to somebody who's got, say, for example, a house or a ranch or something that's in the way of a fire that's encroaching, it's definitely a bad thing, right? It's a disturbance. And so we have to kind of play a balancing act in terms of how we talk about disturbances like fire. And so a lot of the work that we do, and in particular in the southeastern part of the U.S., a lot of our forest ecosystems are entirely dependent on the regular occurrence of fire, right? We have species that just simply would fall out of the ecosystem if they didn't regularly experience fire. Some of the pine species and many others. So when we're talking about restoration, often that means reintroducing the disturbance that might not necessarily exist in a good place in the public consciousness, right? So I'll just put that out there as one of the challenges of the complexity of trying to talk about restoration in the context of disturbance. I can switch gears and talk about invasive species because that's a little bit more cut and dried for me. For example, in parts of the Southeast and across the southern tier of states, really within the US, we have an invasive shrub called Chinese privet, Ligustrum sinensis. This shrub moves into mostly riparian, so close to rivers and streams, bottomland type forests. And after it gets established, it grows up into kind of monoculture stands. We would call it a thicket of privet, right? And so once they get established, then all of the plant diversity falls out in the understory. So single species essentially, and then usually it's embedded in a matrix of taller canopy trees. However, once the canopy trees mature and then they die, once they fall over, there's no reproduction, right? They don't recover when there's a privet invasion. And so some of my Forest Service colleagues decided to do an experiment to look at how a couple of different techniques for removing privet from these forests. What effect would that have on pollinator diversity and bird diversity, and all the easy things that are easy to study above ground from my perspective. And so this had been going on for a few years, and the guy who was in charge of it asked me, if I thought that it'd be worth looking at soil invertebrate populations and communities to see whether or not those were also responding to the removal of the invasive species. And so we said we were game, and we set up a project for a student, and he went out and we dug up holes and kind of collected all of the invertebrates that we could find. And so sure enough, it turned out that if you do the restoration above ground of removing the invasive species, what we found was that it also had beneficial effects for the below ground community. So specifically what we found was that so we also have invasive earthworm species in these soils. And so when you remove the invasive plant, it also had the effect of reducing the numbers of one of the invasive species of earthworms. And in addition to that, it had the effect of increasing the numbers of one of our native earthworm species. So we thought that could be described only as a win-win situation. And so what you hope is that if you do things that influence the below ground diversity and the below ground community in such a way as to bring it more into the native state, what we would consider to be the native natural state, then that more completely constitutes ecosystem restoration than you might otherwise consider, right? So I would say we haven't done a great job of sort of working out the mechanisms behind those patterns that we've seen, but we're working on that, and hopefully we'll have some new information to bring to bear on that.
Yeah, that's actually one of the areas I wanted to bring up, which was that I recently saw a few of your research papers around how, say, soil ecology connects to restoration ecology,
Mm-hmm.
or sometimes doesn't. So it's
Yeah.
like, when it comes to the history of this discipline, I wanted to ask about that. How did this first get started? What were some of the barriers along the way? And today, is it still somewhat left field? Is it still not as integrated as it could be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that depends on who you're talking to an extent, but I would certainly say that the discipline of restoration ecology as a discipline has existed. And I think the Society for Ecological Restoration was founded, 40 years ago or something, so relatively young to a guy like me anyway. And so I think that the definition of what restoration ecology is still a moving target to an extent and still being worked out. And that's a good thing. That I think that implies that it's a vigorous and rigorous discipline that's interested in self-evaluation. So I would say that from the beginning, restoration ecology, the restoration practitioners have recognized that soils are certainly important, but maybe the degree to which they're important has not always been understood. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, but it's been our thesis that restoration ecology has proceeded primarily as a botanical science, right? That people are interested in getting plants to grow where they want them to grow in the mix that they want them to grow in, right? So you want a diverse plant community, and there may have been an unspoken assumption that if you just put the propagules of the plant community that you want on the ground, then they will grow. And so I think that when that doesn't happen the way that you think it's going to, it doesn't proceed the way you think it's going to, you can often relate that failure to establish the plant to something that's happening in the soil. I don't mean to make an indictment here of the botanist, right? They're just doing what they think is right. And I don't know that I have answers necessarily in cases where things fail, but you can frequently trace it back to things that are happening in the soil. And again, as I say, so when you have to restore something, it means that you're already starting with something that's degraded. Certainly, there's a wide spectrum of types and degrees of degradation. So if you start with a place that essentially has been disturbed to the point that it doesn't have soil, so I'm thinking in particular places where they do this, surface mining for coal, for example, mountaintop removal for the extraction of coal resources. So you start with a pretty profoundly degraded system there. And so if you, if step one for the restoration is get some soil, then obviously soil is going to be an important part for the restoration, right? And so, in these cases where something has been really heavily disturbed, or maybe you've got some kind of contamination, heavy metal contamination, or petroleum contamination, and really the only thing you want is just to grow a plant, any plant, and you don't care what it is, then you can do some fairly straightforward, simple, single factor manipulations of the soil and probably improve your success, right? But if your restoration goal is more complex, then I think that your understanding of soil processes also needs to be more nuanced and more complex. And so you need to have some consideration of how the other biota, for example, fungi or maybe ants or some invertebrate, how those organisms are going to influence the way the plants become established and how plant diversity is influenced by their behavior. And I think that we can do some fairly straightforward experimentation, and there have been some people who've been doing this kind of thing to see whether or not those kinds of relationships in the soil influence the outcome of restoration efforts.
I think it's very intriguing how it's always like a little bit of a changing puzzle, because that makes personally people like me who are going to be entering into these fields later, it gives an opportunity. Like there is still some area where different individuals can contribute.
It's wide open. I would say it's wide open, and I should say this too: is that because of the complex nature of how soils arise and how they interact with their plant community, we've been calling it context dependency, right? So it really depends on where you are and sort of what pieces of the puzzle you have to work with is often going to dictate what the potential for restoration is in a particular place. It's a little bit of a moving target too with things like climate change proceeding, climate change, nitrogen deposition from the atmosphere, CO2 concentrations going up. All these things have potential to influence what a particular place on the globe is going to be able to support in terms of an ecosystem, right? And so I think that may be one of the most exciting things that we're faced with as society, as human society, is deciding in light of how those things are changing, the climate's changing, and we're going to eventually reach a point where the climate on a particular latitude of the globe is not going to be supportive of the vegetation that has been there for most of human history, right? And so we're going to have to make decisions about what we really want, like which parts of which ecosystems, first of all, is it possible to keep? And second of all, do we want to keep? And so I think that there's going to be a whole lot of ecosystem creation that has to happen in the restoration ecology world. Maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in yours or maybe your children's or grandchildren's lifetimes. That's what restoration ecology is going to be about. It's going to be about, do we have a soil that is compatible for a type of vegetation that has not been there for potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of years, right? So that'll be a big challenge for future generations, I think, of restoration people.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what my last rapid fire question was about. If you could think about your own niche here, what do you think are one or two of the biggest open questions?
Well, again, I would say that probably the biggest frontier that is open to us as soil ecologists is getting a good quantitative grip on just how much diversity there is, biodiversity there is. And in this case, I'm not talking about the animals that we can see and, like you might look at an earthworm and go, oh yeah, that's an earthworm, right? But we're talking about microscopic organisms in this case, so bacteria and fungi and archaea and single cell, maybe sometimes colonial organisms, but the tiny things that are microscopic, right? And we know enough to know that they're incredibly diverse and that they really are sort of context dependent to an amazing degree. So if you take a soil sample right here next to my feet and then you walk 10 meters away and take another soil sample, it's possible that the microbial communities, they'll be somewhat similar, but they'll be more different than you might expect over a distance of 10 meters, say. And so I think that our ability to understand not just the diversity, but also the attendant functions that are associated with those organisms. So it pains me to an extent to say this because I'm an organismal, like more of a fauna person, but it's true that the microbes are really the ones that are doing most of the work in soil ecosystems, and it's their metabolic capacity and their functionality that makes soil processes work. And so I think that the more we develop our understanding of how soil microbial communities, first of all, how they come to be and how their sort of community assembly rules work, I think we're making good headway in that arena. But sort of the next step then is to kind of get into the omics, the metagenomics of microbial community function. And so this is sort of like what, when we sample the microbial community, we look at the ecosystem DNA, the entire ecosystem DNA profile, and look for particular genes that do particular things. And I think that developing a really nuanced and clear and comprehensive understanding of that is probably it's a frontier, frankly, at this point. But I think that it's the key to real understanding of soil ecosystems and should lead us in a direction that we will be able to hopefully manipulate those things in the direction that we want to achieve restoration in a place where we need to do something that might not have happened there before.
Thank you for just painting this amazing picture of like so much exploration and
Yeah.
curiosity. It just makes me think how quite literally we understand more about space, about our atmosphere than we do about the world beneath our feet, about the oceans, like our hydrosphere.
Yes. Well, it's definitely a labyrinthine thing that you can get into and you might not be able to get back out of once you start. So that's certainly been the case for me. It never ceases to fascinate.
Mm.
At least for me, that's been the case, and so that's why I keep going. I'll keep going as long as they'll let me.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful note to wrap up on, and I think that it has been quite a very unique podcast, and I really appreciated getting to take the time today.
Good. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.